In this section, we'll talk about some of the other features of the IDE itself, some of the panes, the toolbox, online help, some of the features that make it easier for you to do your work. So let's begin by talking about the project properties. You may have noticed in the Solution Explorer, and I mentioned before, the My Project entry. I can right-click and open or double-click that. And it's just another pane. It's not a modal dialog. I can switch back and forth between them. But I now have my project properties up in their own pane. They are tabbed along the left side. Makes it less confusing with the horizontal tabs already in place up here. So we start out with the Application tab. The assembly name is typically going to control the name of the executable, in this case, exploringvb.exe. The root namespace is a means of categorizing your code. Code in one library may have one namespace, and in a different library has another. We'll talk about namespaces more in the course on the .NET framework. But just know it's a way of keeping your classes in the object-oriented world, your classes and objects categorized into various naming entities. This application was created as a Windows application. I can just from here change it to a class library or a console application. I can set an icon to be used for the executable when it builds. If I had multiple forms, I could set which is the startup form. I could also create a module with a public sub main method, and then the main method would start instead of the form. But typically in a Windows application, you'll start with a form. And this is what will appear when the application starts, and when the window's closed, the application closes as well. There's also some information that gets embedded in the assembly. I should make it clear the assembly is a term in .NET for the container of code itself. Typically it's an exe or a DLL, but that container, that package of object definitions, your code itself when it's compiled, is referred to as an assembly. So the title of this assembly is by default the same as the assembly name, Exploring VB, although that could be changed. And then you can type in various other fields as well, depending on if you wanted to give it a company name, trademark information, if you wanted to give an explicit version number. These are all options that you have. And then the application framework makes it really easy to inherit the nice rounded edges and the bright colors of the Windows XP visual style. If you check this box, then your executable can't be launched more than once. If it's already running, it'll give an error message and it won't run again. We'll talk about the Compile tab for a moment. This shows where your executable will be saved to. It's in the bin/release folder in this case. Your option explicit, option strict, and option compare for the project defaults. This can be overridden, but by default for the project, they're set right here. And then there's various errors when it compiles. You can tell it how to treat them. Should it be considered a warning or an error, or should it just not care at all? So in this case, by default, actually, an implicit conversion does not cause any message to be spit out. If you have a local variable that never gets actually used, maybe this is something that you ended up renaming something by mistake, whatever reason it never got used, it will spit out a warning, but it won't prevent you from running the code. But if you consider that a serious offense, you could change that to be treated as an error instead. The Debug tab is related to starting up the project when you start the debugger or when you press F5. You can set command line arguments. Depending on what type of application you're creating, you might want to pass an argument when the application starts up, maybe to show a splash screen or not, or to pass a file name. When you're debugging, you might want to make sure that you have the ability to send those command line arguments. You would still want to debug it, but yet you want to launch it with an argument, and otherwise you wouldn't be able to do that. So you can specify any parameters you wanted here. You can browse to a working directory, so if you wanted it to launch from your documents folder or something like that, you can set that here. We're going to talk about references in the project. And this is one view of your references. This shows all the DLLs that your project uses. And you can add additional references. There's different types. A reference, what this means is you can take advantage of code that belongs somewhere, that comes from somewhere else. So these are all .NET components. And you can integrate them into your code. If you add one of these as a reference, then all of the code contained in there is accessible to your application. So this would be like loading a DLL. Once you've added it as a reference, it'll show up in your references and you'll have the ability to create objects and work with the code that's in there. You can also work with COM objects. In the COM tab, this shows all of the registered COM objects on your system. And this is a really cool feature. If you select one of the COM objects and you say to add a reference to it, not only does it load that COM object and create a reference to it with a namespace, but it actually generates wrapper code for you. So it will look just like any other .NET object if you add it as a reference. So this is really convenient, and it really gives you access to a lot of other code. If you were ever worried, maybe you've heard that it's hard working with an unmanaged component. If you're working with a COM object, something that didn't start as .NET, it's really not that hard to work with at all. Once you import it, it generates all that wrapper code for you. Sometimes there's some weirdness with some of the data types, but in general, it gets handled very nicely behind the scenes for you. So you get to just work with it like any other object. The Projects tab. Now, if we had multiple projects, we would refer to this as a solution, and then we'd have projects within the solution. Right now, we have one project, and so by default, Visual Basic Express does not show the solution node. But if we had a second project, we might use it as a library project, a DLL. Maybe we had some math routines or some business-specific routines in there. We could put a link to it, adding a reference to that project here, and it would show in this list, and it would make sure that that project is always built when the main project is built. And then the Browse button, of course, lets us just browse to anything else on the system we wanted to add a reference to, or Recent will show us the last few things that we've added references to. Next, we'll talk about settings. Settings is another very powerful option. We're actually going to create a setting, and just as the name implies, these are the user-specified options for how the application runs. Usually you go to maybe the Tools menu and click Options or something like that. This does not generate a user interface for the user to set your options, but this takes care of loading and saving the options for you and making it really easy to bind to your controls. And I'll show you what I mean. Let's create a new option. Call this the message value. And by default, it's a string. We've actually got a lot of flexibility: color, font, size, any kind of numeric type. What type of value? And let's think about where we might use this. If we had a checkbox in the application that says, should I run with Windows on startup, for instance? We'd want that to be a checkbox in our user interface, but the value itself would be a Boolean, true or false. The scope then determines if it's user or application-wide. If it's an application level setting, then anybody on this computer would have the same value for this. And if somebody changed it, it would affect everybody. Whereas user-specific lets each person have their own settings. Generally speaking, you're probably going to want to use user-level settings. Somebody might use it to set the fonts or the size or something to that effect. And you'll want to make sure you respect that for each unique user on the computer. The value lets you set a default. So if there is no value for this, when it starts up, it will automatically use the default value that you specify. We'll leave that blank. We won't actually set a default. And now that we've created a setting, let's go back to our code. Actually, let's go back to the designer. And let's look at the message text box. And what we want to do is use the value of this text box as a saved setting. So we go to the Application Settings entry in the Properties view, and we click the Browse button, and it automatically jumps to the text property. Remember, the text property is what is contained in the text box. That is called the text property. And we want it to be linked to the message value setting, or we could click New if we needed to create a new setting. Now, with just a few clicks, I didn't write any code whatsoever. I've now made it so that when the application starts up, it'll check the settings file to see if anything has been saved in there before. If not, it will use the default value. Remember, we didn't set a default value, so nothing will show up in that case. Why don't we just set a default value, just to be very clear? We'll set a default value, so if nothing else is saved, it will use that. And in fact, notice it's now reflected that way. It's showing the default value. And so now if I run the application and I set this, it's going to save it, and next time it reloads the application, that setting will still be there. There's only one step required. I'm going to go into the echo method, and as soon as they click the echo button, I want to make sure that these are saved. By default, it doesn't do the saving. I have to tell it when to save, and I do that by calling my.settings.save. And just that easily, I will be able to save the settings. And you may wonder why it does that. Why doesn't it just save it automatically? This is actually a really good thing. If you wanted to implement a settings form, probably not just a simple echo like this, but if you had a checkbox to control one thing and a text box for how big the form is, something to that effect, you may want an OK and cancel button down here. You don't always want the settings to be saved just because the user modifies the value. So you can wire it up so that you can hit the save button where it makes sense in your code. You can also use reload if you want to revert the settings back to the way they were last saved. So they can make all the changes they want to, and then if they hit the cancel button, you can just reload and go back to the way they were. So with that one line added to our code, everything else was all just point and click. A few things we had to type in, but only one line of code was actually added. Let's start up the application again. And as expected, we're seeing the default value since it hasn't been run before. Nothing has been set. When I click echo, it shows that value. So let's change it to something else. When I click echo, it now shows the message box with that value, and I'm going to quit the application and restart it. And there's my value from last time. I did not have to add any code to load the settings. I didn't have to add any code to set the text box value to the setting value. Because I made that change in the properties view, I get all of that for free. It's a very powerful option. Let's talk about the toolbox a little bit. We've already talked about how we can pin the pane. We can also change it to be floating. A tab document actually puts it right along in here with the other documents that are open. Auto hide. That's when we had the pin pointing the other way, and then we can tell it to just hide. I've already pointed out how you can open and close the various tabs, and we can show as many as we want to at once. We can also right-click and choose items like we could in VB6, or add new tabs. So if I add tab, the cursor is right here. I can type in the name for my new tab. Then I can take controls. Maybe I want my timer. I'm going to copy that from there, and I want to paste it down in my new tab. Maybe these are my most commonly used controls here. So we can take one from there, take the group box, and copy it and paste it down here. I could actually drag and drop them as well, but if I do that, it will disappear from the one section, and so that's why I would use the copy and paste probably instead. And if I decide I don't want it, actually I can move it up and down through the list, collapse it or open it, and then delete the tab if I need to. And as I said, I can use choose items if I want to see the complete list of all of the controls, and if I wanted to add some that maybe aren't in the list by default. As you can see, it's a pretty extensive list though. So I'm going to delete the new tab. And let's talk about help. If we look in the help menu, got a number of options here. The how do I, this was actually also referenced from the start page. The how do I is a very convenient feature. It shows me a number of different scenarios: data access, deployment, Windows application, security, and it just gives me a number of task-based ways of getting help. Instead of having to search on a specific keyword, maybe I just want to spend some time and learn about data. So let's talk about storing and accessing data. Let's talk about creating a database. Let's talk about connecting to a database. It's a number of just themed samples and help files to really help me get an overview of a certain subject and get a lot of information on it. I can also search the help index. I can just view the index, browse down through there. A lot of this should be familiar from VB6. And I can even set my own help topics as favorites to go back to later. I can also ask a question. If I do this, I will be redirected to the Microsoft community forums, the news groups. If you don't have an account set up, you might want to set up an account so that you can ask your own questions. And then later on, you can check your status of your question. This will show the list of questions you've asked along with any responses you may have received. And then you can send feedback as well. All of those are available either from the help menu or from the community menu. And of course, if you have a higher version of Visual Studio than Express, then you're entitled to other support from Microsoft as well. But these are options that are available to any user, even the free Express Edition users of the tool. And I'm just going to very briefly point out the Data Sources window. Data binding is extremely simple in Visual Basic 2005. I can add data sources such as databases, but also web services, and even just any business object in my project. I can wrap it as a data source, and then I can bind it to text fields or list boxes or whatever other control I want to. It's an extremely easy way of taking data and working with it within the user interface, and it takes a lot of the work out, a lot of the heavy lifting is taken out. It's a wonderful feature.